afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Olson. I'm a faculty member here at Loyola in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. And I'm going to provide a little bit of information that's intended to kind of set the stage for Mike Jacobson's presentation, talking a little bit about the general issues with respect to jails, but more specifically, information about the jail in Cook County. We put this program together with the idea that there's been a lot of discussion about prison reform and sentencing policy as it affects prisons. There's been a lot of move, particularly in Illinois, towards enhancing the effectiveness of probation in the state. But the issue of jails and jail reform and improvements in the jails hasn't gotten a lot of attention, at least historically, although recently in Cook County there has been a lot of discussion about what to try to do to address the situation in the Cook County Jail. So I've got a little bit of information that's intended to kind of put this into some context. When we look at the number of people in jail on any given day, it's less than 1 million, so maybe we don't pay a lot of attention to it because it's not more than 1 million. But when we realize how many people are impacted by jails and go through jails on an annual basis, it's well over 10 million people a year that cycle in and out of jails in the United States. The other thing that's interesting is jail populations, somewhat similar to prison populations, have kind of leveled off in the last couple of years. That's been the case nationally, but from county to county and jail to jail, it isn't necessarily the case. Mike's going to talk a little bit about some of the jail reform efforts he's been involved in and seen across the country, but it's important to keep in mind that there's roughly 3,000 jails in the United States, and every jail is managed and operated by a separately elected official, and therefore policy and reform efforts oftentimes is extremely fragmented. Putting the Cook County Jail into some context, for better or for worse, Cook County Jail is the largest single-site jail facility in the United States. Only the jail systems in Los Angeles and New York are larger than Cook County, but those jail systems are actually spread out over multiple sites in those jurisdictions. So in 2012, the Cook County Jail's average daily population was around 10,000 detainees on any given day, making it the largest single-site facility in the country. The other thing that's somewhat unique about jails is the function they serve and the purpose in terms of either pretrial detention roles or serving as a location where individuals serve a sentence upon conviction. Nationally, about 60% of the people that are in jail in the United States are pretrial detainees. The other 40% are individuals who've been sentenced to jail and are serving their sentence there. However, again, when you look at jails individually, some serve that function more often than others. For example, the Harris County Jail in Texas, almost 60% of the detainees in that jail are sentenced individuals. In Cook County, historically, the jail has been used very little as a sentencing tool and primarily for pretrial detention. So in Cook County, 90% of the people that come and go from the jail are pretrial detainees. In terms of the Cook County Jail and its population, this looks at kind of the long-term trends in admissions to the jail. During the late 90s, early 2000s, on an annual basis, about 100,000 people a year cycled in and out of the Cook County Jail. The number of admissions had been going down consistently until 2011, and it was pretty consistent with trends in crime and trends in arrests. In the last few years, however, the number of people being admitted to the Cook County Jail has gone up, and primarily what drives the jail population are admissions resulting from arrests by the Chicago Police Department. So the Cook County Jail's population in many ways goes up or goes down depending on the arrest activity of the Chicago Police Department. Also in the last couple of years, this increase in admissions to the jail is counter to what we've seen nationally in terms of the consistent decrease in the number of people going to jail. When we look at the average daily population of the jail, on any given day, there's between 8,000 and 10,000 people in the jail. Some recent research that some colleagues at Loyola and I have done have found that about a quarter of the people that are admitted to the jail have recently been receiving services for mental health issues. What that doesn't include are people who have not been receiving mental health issues but could benefit from that. So if you're familiar with the dialogue that's been going on in Cook County, you're aware that the sheriff of Cook County has consistently raised the issue about the large number of mentally ill that are detained in the jail and whether or not that's the appropriate place for them to be. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind about the jail population is the lines I showed you before were somewhat smooth and showed some nice clear patterns. The jail population, however, varies dramatically on a month-to-month basis, and it really is a seasonal pattern that's reflective of either crime in the city or arrest activities in the city. So I just leave you with this information so that you can kind of keep in mind when you hear about the jail population reaching high levels. If it's July or August, don't be surprised about that. And if the jail's at a really low level and it's February, again, you shouldn't necessarily be surprised, because that tends to be the pattern that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. Is the peak is usually around August, September, and then the lowest number is usually in February. The area on the graph that's circled illustrates a pattern that kind of bucked that trend. In 2012, we had an unusually warm spring. Crime didn't go down like it always had, and arrest activity didn't go down like it always had. And as a result, we didn't see that drop in the population. And in many respects, the jail's been trying to overcome that or address that ever since that point in time. It wasn't until last February, which was the coldest February on record, that we saw a lot of the crime activity and arrest activity go down, and as a result, the jail population has dropped down to a more expected, relatively low level. The last couple things is just to educate you and make you aware of what happens to people who are in the jail and under the custody of the sheriff. The jail is primarily what the sheriff gets a lot of attention for, and it's his biggest responsibility. But realize that there are a lot of other individuals that the sheriff has custody over. At the end of December of this past year, almost 13,000 people were under his custody. About 3/4 of those are physically incarcerated in the jail, and the other quarter are under some form of community-based supervision, either on electronic monitoring or day reporting, or some of the other programs that were put in place in the mid-90s to try to address the issue of jail crowding. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, and our speaker is going to talk about this, is the function that jails oftentimes serve varies. I'll leave you with a couple points to kind of drive this home. Oftentimes we argue that we use jail because we need to detain the dangerous, or we need to incapacitate those who are too violent to be in the community prior to the disposition of their case. But realize almost everybody who goes to the jail is discharged back into the community in a relatively short period of time. So out of the 82,000 people who were admitted to the jail in 2013, only about 20% are discharged to the prison system. The other 80% are released either on bond, or they're put on probation, or their charges are dropped. So there's a large number of people that go into the jail that eventually we realize aren't as dangerous and therefore can be released back into the community. One of the things that we've identified as driving some of the increases in the jail population has been the increase in length of stay of people in the jail. Realize that even relatively small changes in length of stay, what this graph shows is that from 2010 to 2013, the average length of stay of people in the jail went up by about 5 or 6 days. But when you multiply an extra 5 or 6 days across the 80,000 people in the jail, it translates to an average daily population that's potentially 1,000 higher than it would have been had the length of stay remained consistent. The last point and the last piece of information I'll leave you with before we hear from our speaker is the majority of people who go to the jail stay a relatively short period of time. 40% of the people that go to the jail are released from the jail within 3 weeks and go somewhere other than prison. So we use a lot of resources and we put a lot of effort into incapacitating or detaining people for an extremely short period of time, and eventually do release them back to the community. At the other end of the continuum, about 15% of the people that stay in the jail stay for more than 3 months. And oftentimes they do end up in prison, but oftentimes they also end up on probation or have their charges dropped, or they're found not guilty. So the jail's challenges are, how do we deal with this large volume of people for whom we have relatively brief contact with, and they're there for a relatively short period of time, while balancing that against the much smaller percent of the people that are coming in that are going to stay for a much longer period of time. So I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of context for our speaker's discussion. This information that I presented has been published through Loyola. If you're interested in getting copies of the research, I can provide you with information about how to get to that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Steeman, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm Don Steeman. I'm an associate professor here at Loyola. I just wanted to make sure I got some face time. As the only other organizer who's not going to talk today, I wanted to make sure I got in front of you as well. But it's really a pleasure that I get to introduce Michael Jacobson, our guest speaker today. I worked for Michael at the Vera Institute of Justice for several years. He'll tell you, he doesn't want to embarrass me, that I was his best employee. Maybe, is that right? That's right. But Michael comes with as one of the leading experts in the country about both prison and jail reform. He was the commissioner of probation in New York City from 1992 until 1996. He was the commissioner of corrections from 1995 until 1998. After that, he was at CUNY, and before he became the director and president of the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City, where he really saw an expansion of Vera's work both locally, nationally, and internationally, working around issues from policing to corrections and reentry. He's since left Vera, and now he's the director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governments at the City University of New York. I don't want to take a lot of time introducing him because he's got a lot to say and he's going to be very interesting. So, Michael, please.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Loyola for inviting me. I guess, so I've been asked, as you know, to talk about jail reform, which, depending on the tack you take, could be a really short talk. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of jail reform in the United States, and if you look at the nation's, if you go remember Dave's chart before, that sort of a lot of those jails, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, all have had a history of well-known problems, both condition problems, population problems, overcrowding problems. Chicago is by far not the only city to experience those kinds of jail problems, and it's not because of the quality of the people that work in those places. They're just very, very difficult places to operate, and what is, as I'll talk about a little, can be a sort of irrational environment. And it's not just the big city jails that have had history of problems. Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, right? I mean, it's an institution in the United States that is a very problematic one for a number of reasons. But so I thought what I do is a few things. One is people have mentioned prison reform a couple of times. I thought I'd start out with just a short discussion about the current sort of dynamics, sort of political and fiscal dynamics around prison reform in the United States. A little bit of a discussion about why those dynamics are amenable to prison reform at a state level, and then whether or not those same dynamics are or can be apparent at a local level. So I'll do that first. I'll then talk for a few minutes about what is actually needed sort of substantively and politically to achieve jail reform, a few minutes on what jail reform even means. I'll talk just for a couple of minutes. I want to give a couple of short examples, really just by way of illustration, comparing Chicago and New York. And I should say, some of you may know that this fellow named Tom Ross, who was the chief judge in North Carolina for years and years, he's now the chancellor of the University of North Carolina. When I first came to Vera, and we were discussing sort of ramping up Vera's national work, and we wanted to do more work around the country, one of the things Tom said to me, it's all a great idea. The one piece of advice I have for you is don't you ever talk about New York City when you're doing your work around the country. First of all, you're from New York. Second of all, you sound like you're from New York. And third of all, no one cares about New York. So don't talk about New York. And I get that, and I get especially, and it's some reason why in every city there's always sensitivity to that. I mean, there's just a whole skyscraper thing that we kicked your butt on. So I know there may be some sort of just general New York sensitivity, but it is, because when you go back to that chart and you see the three sort of jail systems, the three big systems in the country are really New York, LA, and Chicago. It's worth some talk about how those systems compare to each other, both for good and bad. And I'll raise some of the issues that are apparent in both those systems. And then finally, I'll spend a little bit of time on given all the challenges, given how much there is to do, the sort of what is to be done question. So let me start out with the current dynamics around prison reform in the United States, right? And so many of you, I'm sure, have either studied this or are involved in it in one way or another, right? This is a very opportune time for prison reform at a state level in the U.S. There's a tremendous amount of ferment around downsizing prisons, reforming prisons. That we're entering our fourth straight year, I guess, of decline in the overall national prison population. Not huge declines, but there's probably been about a cumulative 5% decline in national prison populations in 3 to 3.5 years, which doesn't sound like all that much, and at some level, obviously, it isn't. But after about 40 years of straight up growth, it's actually a very important and symbolic, in some ways, dynamic, and that's happened for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons it's happened is because there have been a variety of sort of national structural factors that have come together to make prison reform, and I'm separating this from jail reform now, particularly sort of welcoming, right? This really is a historical moment in a lot of ways. A number of my colleagues and I and people here have written about this. It's an unusual moment in the U.S. So I'll just go through quickly why that is, right? There's nothing like a good meltdown of the global economy to sort of focus policymakers on things they'd rather not think about. But the fiscal condition of states particularly, while improving marginally in the last year, is still pretty bad. State economies lag behind a national economy anywhere from 3 to 5 years. State economies in general are going to be hugely constrained in the next several years. And so, all else being equal, correction reform is always sort of a tough thing to think about politically. In the context of state actions that can involve laying off teachers and firefighters and throwing little kids off health insurance, right? Correction reform is sort of on the table in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. So there's nothing particularly good about a huge national recession, but ironically, for correctional reform, it's actually not a bad thing. The reform can never just be about money. It can't just be all about saving money, because you'll always get the political blowback in the United States that if all you want to do is save money, you can't put a price on public safety. We're going to do whatever we need to do to protect our citizens, and we'll spend money even if we don't have it. So it can't just be about money, but the fiscal thing is hugely, hugely important at a state level. There have also, at a national and state levels, been huge, very significant changes in public opinion around crime in the United States. There's a whole body of work of this in the criminological literature, and Frank Cullen and others have done a huge amount of work here. But if you just look at, Gallup and Harris both do these national polls every year. They ask the same questions every year. They both ask some version of what's the biggest problem that your local government should be dealing with. The answer to that question for years, from the sort of mid-'80s to the late 90s, I guess, the number one response to that by far was crime, right? Crime was by far the biggest concern of the American public in terms of what the government should be doing. In the intervening 12 or 14 years, last year, I think it was last year, in either the Gallup or Harris poll, the answer, crime, didn't even reach a level of statistical significance to make it on to that response. It's a little complicated because in the intervening time, you get things like terrorism or the war on terror. But when you strip those away and you just look at what the public thinks of in terms of its local government, state government should be doing, the issues are all about health, education, and the economy. I mean, crime is just not remotely the issue it once was. And that is, in my opinion, a good thing. Because when crime is an issue, nothing good can come of that. It's been and sort of remains a hugely politicized issue in the U.S., much less so, as I'm saying, than it used to be. But it's the fact that it's not, that there are pressures on government to deliver in other parts of government, mostly health, education, and the economy, is actually very helpful. The other thing that sort of rounds out that dynamic a little, right? So there's no money, there's almost no pressure from state residents for state government to build more and more prisons. There's just not that kind of political pressure. All the pressure is around health, education, taxes, the economy. But the fact is, and this has been true over about the last 17 years, the only thing in state budgets that grows as a percent of state budgets, right? Everything grows in absolute terms, but the only thing that grows as a percent of state budgets is corrections, right? It's not completely true because the other thing that is the biggest grower is Medicaid, right? But that's not really a state program, so put that to the side for a minute. The only really base function of state government that grows every year as a percentage of state government is the prison system. It's not social services, it's not education, not primary education, not secondary education, not environmental protection, not transportation, not nothing. It's just corrections. And so when you sort of wrap all that together, you get at a state level this sort of interesting dynamic. There's no money, there's a huge look to save money and to cut money. There's no call to build more prisons. There is a call to deliver and spend more on health and education. But policymakers still have to keep dumping money into corrections, for which there's no, at the moment, sort of general political support, right? So that's changed the dynamic pretty significantly at a state level, and it's one of the reasons you see all these states around the country, about 26, about half the states roughly, have had declines, some pretty significant in their prison system. The other interesting thing that's happened at the state level is that, at the sort of national level around states, is this interesting alignment between the left, what I'm calling the left, and the right, or sort of traditional progressives around the issue of prison reform, and very traditional conservatives. So for a lot of traditional conservatives now, there's a group some of you may know called Right on Crime. They're based in Austin, Texas. They're sort of an interesting bunch, and they're, I don't know if it's the board of directors, but it includes people like Grover Nordquist and David Keene, who's the head of the American Conservative Union, Newt Gingrich, right? It's a bunch of very conservative people. And they formed a group called Right on Crime, which obviously is a little play on words. But what's interesting about that is that for them, for a lot of conservatives now, the issue of prison reform, of mass incarceration, it's something you sort of associate with kind of, liberals or progressives decrying. For a lot of these conservatives, very sort of hardcore conservatives, this has now become a poster issue for big government run amok. And they happen to be correct, right? The prison systems in the United States are big government run amok. There is, if that's your issue, there's no better example than the growth in prisons, going from 200,000 to 2.2 million in jails and prisons, right? It's sort of unrestrained growth in the last 4 decades. And the other thing from a conservative point of view is that when conservatives look at it, you have this huge buildup, this huge reach by government into building prisons and incarcerating more and more people, but for them they also look at, the outcomes. So what are the outcomes? About half of all people who leave prison go back to prison within 3 years at a huge cost, let's call it $70 billion more or less. So for conservatives, it offends their fiscal sensibilities, right? It's government overreach, it's huge government, it's gigantic expense, it's massive failure. For them, if this was a business, it would be shut down, no one would tolerate this. And you're paying this much money for this much failure. Plus, it dovetails a little with the sort of right-wing, faith-based kind of redemption and second chance feeling that a lot of those folks have. So I don't want to sort of dwell on this, but it's a very interesting political alignment now on this issue. I can't think of another issue where that alignment is even close to existing, but it's a very helpful dynamic. And provides conservatives, especially, all sorts of political cover for states that want to do things like reduce mandatory minimum drug sentences or do parole reform or to generally lower their prison population. They have cover from the right wing. So anyhow, so you sort of add all that up, and at the state level, right, around prison reform, it's a very interesting sort of propitious time for prison reform. And so, as I said, you have these third year of declines. You have groups like Pew Charitable Trust and Vera and the Council of State Governments running around the country doing this prison reform work. You have the federal government, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, making big investments in justice reinvestment and Second Chance Act. I mean, there's just a lot of ferment. There are academics now. Todd Clear, who some of you know, I'm sure, is one of them, who with his colleague Natasha Frost, just wrote a book that essentially says this is, when you're given some version of what I just said, this is the end of America's punitive turn. We're at the beginning of the end of mass incarceration. You can either think that's right or not, and it's probably a little more complicated than that, but you could see why people would start to say that. All right, so those are all the dynamics at a state level, right? So now let's switch to the local level, which is what we're here to talk about. How do those dynamics translate to a local level? Well, not perfectly at all, right? There's not no overlap, but it's certainly not perfectly. So why is that? So it's worth spending a few minutes on some of the sort of minutiae here. So state prison systems are, in the end, compared to jails, pretty simple places. There's one state prison system per state. The governor is the person in charge. And if the governor and usually two people who run both houses of the legislature, if those people, for whatever reason, want to do some stuff around prison reform, done, right? So if you get a legislature and a governor that are both interested in, repealing mandatory minimum sentences or redefining the role of parole, which is an executive agency, those two branches of government, the legislature, and the leaders of those branches of government, can make incredible progress. You don't, at a state level, for state prison reform, you don't need the judiciary. You can use them if you want to. I'm sure a lot of them wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but for sentencing reform, for parole reform, not necessary to have the judiciary on board in state after state. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but in the end, laws are written by the legislature and signed into law by the governor. So it really is much easier in some ways at a state level. It's a little simplistic, the way I'm sort of putting it now, because I don't have that much time, but it's the dynamics at the state level are really, in some ways, neater, cleaner, and simpler. So what is apparent at the local level that's still true at the state level? Well, I'd argue the fiscal situation is roughly similar. I mean, very different because we're talking about cities and counties versus states, but the fiscal outlook for cities and counties is just as bad as it is for states. The multi-year outlook for most big cities and counties is not particularly encouraging. Revenue collections are generally down. The pressures on spending are up, and counties and cities for years are going to have to make very tough decisions about what they invest in, how much revenue they collect, how much taxes they raise or not. And because jails are incredibly expensive, they vary hugely by jurisdiction, but they're a lot of money, right? The sort of fiscal pressures are not exactly the same, but they should be apparent at both the state and local level. So what about public opinion, right, which we know at the state level and national level in a fair amount of detail. We don't really know at the local level. I actually haven't seen any work done on public opinion polling at local levels around jails, or what people think of jails, or whether they're willing to downsize jails. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Most, jails are much more sort of inside baseball part of government than prisons. They're for pretrial detainees. They use bail or not. I mean, they're a very sort of mundane part of government bureaucracy. And I think for the general public, they have trouble distinguishing between a jail and a prison. It's all people who are locked up. And polling around that would be difficult, although I don't see any reason why that dynamic, when the public, to the extent you can educate the public around jails and what the purpose of jails is and how much money you spend on jails and what happens as a result of jail, I don't know why that public opinion couldn't be similar to the state level public opinion as well. It's just that we actually know a fair amount about state and national public opinion about prisons. We know very little about jails, but I think there are reasons to believe that it would actually be pretty useful to do that kind of polling. At a state level, at a national level, there's a whole literature on what works in corrections, right? What works for rehabilitation, how to keep people from coming back to prison, how to keep people from re-entering prison. There's a huge literature on re-entry, on diversion. Much less so in terms of jails. In fact, even the question about what works in jail is an interesting question in and of itself. What does that question even mean in terms of a jail system that's designed to handle pretrial detainees? What kind of work are you looking for, right? Are you going to do massive amounts of rehabilitation in jail? I don't think so, right? People are in jail for, I think their Chicago figure was an average of 54 days, which means half the people are there for less than 54 days, right? And it's not a lot of life-changing stuff you can do with people. And if you remember Dave's chart, a huge number of them are out even within 72 and 96 hours, right? Jails are just huge churning operations, right? And so prisons are pretty stable environments. People are there for years. You sort of know how long they're there for the day they come in. It's not at all true of jails. They're much more chaotic places. So when you talk about work, what jails should be doing, in a lot of ways it's a more complicated question than you ask around prisons. And so you tend to think of, well, what's best practice? What makes the most sense? What should a good jail, what should a sort of best practice jail do? What should it look like? And I think certainly in the field, certainly among experts, there's general agreements on the principle of what works in jail or what good jail should look like. One is they should hold the fewest people possible, right? Jails for pretrial detainees, the only reason to be held in jail, there are only two reasons. One is if you're a threat to public safety, and two is if you're a threat, if you have a high risk to not appear for a court date on a case. That's it. There's no other reason you should be in jail other than those two reasons. Is that who's in jail? No. There's a ton of people in jail who are not threats to public safety and who would happily reappear at a court date, and I'll talk about that in a minute, especially in the context of Chicago, right? They should be safe, clean, constitutionally run facilities that provide robust health care for all sorts of public health reasons. People should be taken care of, they should get to court on time, and they should transition out quickly, wherever they're going. If they're going to state prison, they should go there quickly. If they're going back to the community, probation, etc. It should all be about the efficient and speedy disposition of justice for the fewest people possible. And again, one of the reasons you want the fewest people possible, and only those people who are threats to public safety or to failure to appear, is that the research tells us now again and again that if you overpunish people who are low risk, low needs, right? If you overpunish those people by incarcerating them or even supervising them too intently in the community, you will turn those people into high risk, right? So jails do this all over the country. You spend a tremendous amount of money to take people who are low risk and you make them high risk, right? You're spending money to buy yourself a public safety problem. Obviously, that's not what you want to be, where you want to be. In terms of the alignment with the right, this way you have on a national level, I don't know why you wouldn't have that same alignment at a city level. All the dynamics are the same. They're huge systems, they overreach, they spend too much money, they lock too many people up, they have hugely high rates of failure and recidivism. So the same things that conservatives object to on the state level should be exactly the same things they would object to on the city level, right? There hasn't been that sort of organizing, there hasn't been that kind of discussion, but no reason, at least in my opinion, why that same, I hesitate to call it a marriage, but that same alignment can't be apparent at a local level in the same way that it is at a state level. And I can tell you at a state level, that alignment, having those conservatives pushing this issue is hugely, hugely helpful. But what are some of the biggest differences, right? And the biggest challenges? How do you get jails to sort of be in the same position that prisons are now, with a lot of ferment, a lot of people looking to reduce them, in fact, being reduced? The biggest challenges with jails compared to prisons, as I said, is a variant of what I was saying before. Prisons are pretty simple. I mean, they're not simple places, but they're pretty simple places ultimately, right? One person runs them. Jails are a collection. Jails are all about process, right? Who gets arrested, who gets sorted, who gets charged, who gets dismissed, who gets released pretrial or not, who winds up in a jail, how long do they stay? All that is a collection of decisions and practices by a countless number of bureaucracies at different levels of government, right? So just take Chicago, which is not that different than a lot of other places, right? You have a county jail, right? It's fed, obviously it's fed largely by Chicago, but it's fed by a variety of policing agencies that make up the county, all of which undoubtedly have different policing strategies. For what reason? No one on earth will ever be able to explain to you. You'll have agencies that decide to make high-volume misdemeanor arrests because that's what they want to do. Some are sort of community-friendly kind of departments. Others concentrate on felonies. It's just a mix, right? But that's the feeder, right? That's the tidal wave of cases coming in is all determined by a bunch of agencies, local police agencies, sheriffs, state police, right? They're the feeder, right? Then you have independently elected prosecutors, right? So they're elected, they have their own power bases, they have their own political interests, they make tons of decisions. What do you prosecute? What do you not prosecute? What do you decline to prosecute? How do you charge? What do you do with all your discretion points that implicate who goes to jail and for how long? Thousands of decisions every day in prosecutors' offices implicate the size of these jail systems. Does anyone know why they make those decisions? No. Because prosecutors are probably the least transparent agency in the criminal justice system. Almost nobody knows how they use their discretion and how those discretion decisions are made. Vera has an interesting project where it's working with prosecutors around the country, but they have a tremendous amount of power, tremendous amount of discretion. As the country has had more and more mandatory sentencing, all those charging decisions have accrued to the power and discretion of prosecutors. And you have public defenders who may or may not be separate, not-for-profit entities. Then you have the judiciary, right, its own branch of government. So they'll decide how long it takes to prosecute, to dispose of cases, whether they dispose of cases efficiently or not, whether felony cases languish, right? It's all about case processing and how the machinery of government operates. Do you have an effective pretrial agency? Do you have any pretrial agency? Who does pretrial? Is it buried in probation? Is it a separate not-for-profit? Is it a separate agency of government? It's all process, right? When you go back to Dave's chart and see, here's the average daily population, here's how long they stay. the way it got there is how all that machinery of government operates. It truly is the sausage making of government is how cases flow through the system and wind up into jail. And the fact is, if you want to do jail reform, right, unlike prison reform, right, there's no analogy to jail reform of the let's get rid of mandatory minimum drug sentences at the state level. We'll do that kind of sentencing reform, and then magically the state population will go down because you'll have fewer people spending time in prison. There is no easy sort of legislative fix. There's no fast law you can pass at a local level that's going to implicate what your jail looks like. I mean, it's not totally true. I suppose you could legalize marijuana, right? And so that would take care of a high-level marijuana arrest. So, I mean, there are some legislative things you could do, but basically, it's all about process reform. And this reform is just hugely difficult and challenging to do. You have different levels of government. You have county government. You have city government. You have independently elected officials. You have sheriffs. Excuse me. You have mayors. You have county boards of supervisors. You have independently elected prosecutors, right? All have their own sort of, their own politics, their own past practice, their own ways of doing things, all completely understandable. But there's no, when you look at what you can do in a state prison, even state prison populations, even complicated things like, fixing your technical parole violation process so not so many people go. Very, very hard to do at a local level. None of it's impossible. It's all sort of doable, but jails, unlike prisons, are really all about process and the interaction of agencies that occasionally have little or nothing to do with each other, and the leaders of those agencies, all of which have occasionally overlapping, but sometimes completely different political and bureaucratic interests. And that is the big challenge of jail reform. So how would you, so I've just given a whole list of, they're not obstacles necessarily, but sort of characteristics about jails that you really have to think very long and hard about in terms of strategies for reforming jails, even sort of these basic reforms that I'm talking about, make them smaller, make the conditions better, get people out faster, even that is a collection of all these decisions in all these various places that I've been talking about. And so when you look around the country, unlike, and there are all sorts of examples I can give you at a state level, New York, Texas, New Jersey, Massachusetts, all of which have made some really interesting decisions that have driven down their populations hugely. Other than New York, which is an odd case, which I'll talk about in a minute, I can't give you a ton of examples of sort of incredible success stories in jail reform. And I'm actually pretty sanguine about this. I think there can be. It's just, you have to be sort of coldly realistic about what it takes. And so one of the things that it will take when you realize sort of how many different bureaucracies are involved in feeding the system and deciding who to feed the system and deciding who to divert and not to divert, who to release on recognizance or who not to, how long to process their cases. To reform that system, a lot of those agencies, a lot of those people who run those agencies have to give something up. They have to relinquish some authority. They have to give up some power. They have to change the way they do business. So you get good things happening over there, even if it causes you some pain. There's sort of no way around it. You can't reform this system without reforming the way the multiple agencies play in this system. And it's doable, it's achievable, I think there are strategic ways to think about it, but it's not easy. So let me sort of go quickly just to talk about a little about the Chicago, New York thing, just to make this a little more concrete. So let's look at New York and Chicago. Now they're interesting comparisons in some ways. You got the three big systems: Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. The interesting comparison at the moment between New York and Chicago is that New York, a city of 8.5 million people with about 350 to 400,000 arrests a year, has a jail system of 11,000, 200 or 300 people. Kind of the same size as the Cook County jail, right? Of a county population of around 5 million, city population, I guess 2 3/4, that has about 200,000 arrests a year, right? So the city in Chicago, the city's a little bigger, but roughly the same size jail system for a city, in New York's case, that starts out with way, way more work being generated by enforcement agencies. So how is that? How does the city have a jail, New York City have a jail system roughly, it's 11.5 versus 10, so it's a little bigger, but roughly in the same general size? Well, the answer is pretty simple. I mean, the explanation is pretty simple. The solution isn't pretty simple. The answer is because New York City is one of those cities, there are several, but it's one that has sort of a best practice around pretrial release, right? It has a separate not-for-profit pretrial agency. Every one of those 350,000 people are interviewed after they've been arrested. There's a very sophisticated risk instrument that's done on every one of them. It's been validated for millions of cases over decades. Judges have incredible confidence in its accuracy. So in New York, about 60% of everyone is released on recognizance, and 50% of all felons are released on recognizance. So New York City has, you saw on that chart they've had, Chicago has, I think it was 81,000, give or take, admissions to jail. That's what New York City has, right? So New York City starts out with a base of arrests like this, but it admits the same number of people to jail as Chicago. And that's because in Chicago, you're basically missing a piece of your criminal justice system. It's just a big piece of the system is missing, right? You don't have a vibrant pretrial capacity in Chicago. People have written about this. Dave has written about this. The Illinois Office of the Courts just did a report about it. I'm sure it has a long, vainglorious history, right? The probation, which is funded to do it, doesn't do much of it. The judges don't like the risk instrument they use, so they don't follow it. There's a million reasons, I'm sure, perfectly legitimate reasons in an irrational environment why that's the case. But if you step back, just as an outsider looking in, you just have a big piece of your system missing. The same happens to be true in Los Angeles, right? That one of the reasons their system is that big is they also they don't have a vibrant pretrial capacity. So, it's one thing for me to stand up here and say that, and I'm not the only person who's ever said that before. It's been written about. But changing that, right? It's not, you can't just sort of do a decree and say, okay, here's what you should do. I mean, you can say that, right? But that's not how life works in the real world, right? Because on a piece of paper, I could do a whole plan for Chicago, right? That says, what the county should do is invest $10 million. The budget for the city pretrial agency that does this, it winds up saving hundreds of millions of dollars, is about $15 million. So the county of Cook should allocate $10 million to do pretrial, create the best risk and needs instrument that it can do. This is a science. We know how to do this. There are many people who can do this. Bring along the judges and aim to have, cut your admissions by 30%. Take that money that's freed up and fund all sorts of fabulous programs that can really reduce crime or address other essential areas of government, right? So on the one hand, it's easy for someone like me to come up here and say you should do that. It's another thing to do it, right? And it goes back to a lot of those challenges. There's tons of history here. There's all sorts of reasons, some good, some bad, while you're in the situation you're in. But in order to change it, to sort of make a break from it, a significant number of people who lead that system have to step up and say they're willing to change it, even at some potential political peril to them. People have to take on risk that they don't have to take on now. People have to change the way they do business that they don't have to do now. And bureaucratically, and you get it, it's very easy to not have to do that. But in the absence of that, there's just no easy fix. You can't just pass a law. You can't just decide to move paper from here to here differently. Right? That's the challenge in jail reform. So that's an interesting difference between New York and Chicago. Roughly same-size jail systems with huge more use of pretrial in the city. One of the similarities, this is true in most of the big systems, they've pointed out your times of disposition going up, the average length of stay going up from, I think it was 48 to 54 days. I don't know what it is for the last 2 decades. I don't know what your sort of long-term trends are. As he said, that 6 days alone costs you, whatever it was, 1,200 extra beds. That's nothing to sneeze at, right? That's a lot of beds. It's a lot of people in for times they shouldn't be in. It's a lot of money you're spending to get nothing in return that you could be spending on something else. New York, worse than Chicago, right? New York has the slowest felony trial courts in the United States. Our lengths of stay, especially for felony cases, are abysmal. No city, I believe, comes close to the length of time it takes New York to process cases. So our system, which is half the size, see another interesting thing about New York. New York's city jail system is 11,500, give or take now. It used to be 23,000 15 years ago. The only jail system in the United States that's had that kind of cut for reasons we can talk about later. And part of the problem with that decline is it masks, right, this huge increase in felony case processing times in New York. The New York jail system should really be about 8,000 beds. It should be even lower. But it's not, because the times that people spend in jail awaiting the disposition of their case keep getting longer and longer and longer. And this goes to something that's apparent in every city, every county, right? There's just a local legal culture that's operated in one way usually for years and years. In New York City, the local legal culture is one that not just tolerates but rewards delay. Prosecutors like delay because the guy's in jail, he's ripening up for a plea, right? Public defenders don't mind it because the case is starting to fall apart, and if you just drag it out, witnesses will disappear, and maybe you'll get a better plea. Judges don't care because, they're not paying for it, and there's no cost to them for long stays. And again, just to give you a sense of how difficult this is, some of you may have seen this, that New York Times maybe it's about a year ago now, did a 4-part series, a front-page series on justice delayed in New York City. And it was all about, in that case it was about the Bronx, but this is true in all the boroughs in New York, about how long cases were languishing in jail, for years sometimes, for really no apparent reason. Like when you read that series, from one part to another part to another part, it was hard to believe you were reading it about a big city in New York, right? Could have been, I don't know, could have been some other country with a sort of dictatorship or no constitutional rights. But was the most interesting is after that 4-part series, which was, I encourage people to read it. They're really well done, just brutal. At the end of the series, what was intriguing to me is not that nothing was done, because nothing was done. It's that no one said anything. Like nobody said anything. The governor, the mayor, not even a city council person. Like no one stood up and said, you can't do this. You can't treat our people this way. These are our citizens. These are our sons, our daughters. You can't keep them in jail for years for no reason. Where was the outrage? There was no outrage. Even in New York, a pretty liberal, sort of progressive place in generally, right? That's the challenge, right? And it's an educational challenge. It's a challenge about getting the public to understand in a way that they sort of do now around prisons, that There's other ways you can do this. There's other ways you can spend this money. There's other ways you can think about public safety. There's other ways you can treat people, right, our people, with dignity, and especially, again, when you think about the people who are in jails and prisons, right, overwhelmingly people of color, right, black and brown, hugely poor. That's apparent in certainly every big city jail. That's who's coming in the door. The race stuff is just apparent at every level in this discussion. So what's the trick? So how do you, with all these obstacles, how would you imagine doing some kind of reform? And I think the trick is, in a lot of ways, we sort of know what to do, right? So in Chicago, you could imagine, if you both had a vibrant pretrial capacity and a commitment, say, by the judiciary to really speed up the disposition of cases and a big sort of operational review of how cases could move, you could have a jail system that's 7,000 beds. Not 11,000. That frees up a tremendous amount of money for which you can improve conditions in the jail, but also spend, in communities, in other public safety. But you have to have a strategy. You have to, and I'm talking generically now, not about Chicago. I could be talking about any place. It's less about what you need to do, because there's a lot of smart people who could figure out what you need to do. The part that's essential is figuring out how to do it, right? How to get those sort of 800-pound gorillas, right? People who have power to step out and lead and champion some effort, even at some cost to them, their agencies they run, about making a change. And I think there's a political strategy to do that, because there's a fiscal strategy about what you could do with that money. I think there's a political strategy about how you could treat people better, spend money, in education versus jails. I think there's a whole thing you could imagine doing, but you can't do it without getting at least a couple of those, what I'm calling 800-pound gorillas to really step up and lead something. And that's, it's easy to say something like that, and I recognize it's very difficult to do. But I think there is a strategy to do it, and I'll give you one other quick example before I leave and stop talking. One of the projects we did while I was still at Vera, is Vera has a New Orleans office, and we were invited into New Orleans right after Katrina to do a lot of work around criminal justice. We did a number of things. And New Orleans, essentially, it's actually much worse than Chicago. New Orleans has historically had no ability, they do not, it's unheard of to release anyone on recognizance. I mean, it just doesn't exist. I forget about a pretrial agency. At least Chicago has the contours of a pretrial agency, and there are some people that get released on recognizance. Here in New Orleans, there's no such thing. The only way, historically, you could get released on your own recognizance in New Orleans is if a private attorney, and it must be a private attorney, called the judge. They will not take a call from a public defender. And then lobbied individually on behalf of his or her client, maybe you could get an ROR, right? But no system. So anyway, Vera was asked by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Department of Justice, to essentially help the city build a pretrial capacity, right? It's a city that has a long, not particularly vainglorious history in its criminal justice system. Its jails are some of the worst in the United States. They're about to be the subject of a huge federal consent decree. They spend too much money on their jails. They overpunish. Everything wrong you can do in a city, New Orleans does in its jail system. And so the need is obvious in some ways. Obviously, they need pretrial. When we Vera, started to do the work and sort of building pretrial, we heard from every single judge, every single municipal court judge in the city of New Orleans, every single one said, both privately and publicly, we will never, ever release someone on pretrial, ever. We will never. It was some equivalent of a sort of, some view that it was a Bolshevik plot to overthrow the good working of the U.S. government. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary. And again, it's New Orleans. It's a really interesting place. I have a lot of affection for it. I love the people in the city. They have this whole, Napoleonic Code tradition. It's a very interesting, sort of difficult place. But they with hugely close ties between the bail bonds industry and the judges, right? They're the biggest funder of judicial elections in New Orleans. So, I mean, hugely complicated. But in the New Orleans case, you could have argued in the same way you can argue now. How are you ever going to do this in a place like New Orleans? 100 years of history, all the toxic politics, everything mitigates against doing something like this. But for a variety of reasons, we got both a person on the city council, not a particularly powerful body, but a person on the city council, the mayor, and the DA. We certainly didn't get the judges. The sheriff we had, depending on the day of the week. It's kind of a love-hate sort of a thing. But that was enough, right? And I mean, I shouldn't say it was enough. It was enough to sort of start the process and to build, a pretrial agency. And so now in New Orleans, I think 2.5 years later, I think it's probably about 22% of everyone is released on their recognizance. Not a particularly great number, but a lot better than zero. It's actually probably better than Chicago. So, I mean, it can be done. It just takes, you have to find people, you have to have a political strategy, you have to have perseverance. But, when you have a system like the one you saw, 11.6 million people going to jail, and the United States averages, you have 11.6 million going to people to jail at an average of 25 days, right? That's what it is. That's our system, right? That's the sausage right there. 11.5 million, you keep them for a few weeks, overwhelmingly poor people of color, hugely high levels of mental illness. The jails have become the refuge, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, right? Biggest facilities that house the mentally ill in the United States, right? When you have a system like that, there's no one would ever look at that system, ever, and think, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do that. You'd never do that. You'd never spend money on that, right? And so it should be reformed in the exact same way for similar and different reasons, that the prisons should be reformed, because these are the most, people don't think of them this way, but the folks in jail are largely the most vulnerable people we have, with all the problems I just laid out, right? Some are, in fact, threats to public safety, and they have to be in jail while their case is penned. But when you look at the money we spend and the way the system operates now, I really challenge you to find someone to say, yeah, why would you reform that? I mean, why wouldn't you keep that? Because there's no reason to keep it, because everyone in this room can think of a better system that can detain fewer people more humanely and spend money in more wise ways on the rest to increase public safety. And so I would argue, despite the imperfect analogy with the states and the cities, that in fact the door is open at a local level for this kind of reform, as hard as it will be, right? The door is open. It may not be as wide open as the prison reform door, but it's open. You can imagine it being open even more with the right strategies. And in this field, I think when you see a door like that open, which is all too rare, but when a door like that's open, it's incumbent on all of us to walk through it. Thank you.